The wonderful thing about God is that He speaks a word of hope, even in the darkest of times. And the Scriptures are evidence of that. We are now in a season where we are remembering the post-resurrection appearances of the Messiah, Jesus. And think about if you had been a disciple or believer, a follower of Jesus, expecting Him to set up His kingdom, and instead He goes to the cross. There is a dark time for the disciples. And what we find is that after His resurrection, He appeared to them. And in Acts chapter 1, it tells us that He appeared to them for 40 days. And yet the first two times that Jesus appears, the most important thing that He has on His mind is to equip them, to give them an understanding about what His life and ministry, what the cross, what the resurrection was all about, equipping them so that He might send them out. And my hope and prayer that it is in our study of what Jesus taught in those first two sessions, and that's what we're going to be doing today, that you are equipped, that you're given a new sense of faith and confidence in the supernatural nature of the Scriptures and the predictive promises concerning the Messiah, how He fulfilled them, but not just for your own encouragement, but just as Jesus, those first disciples were equipped so that He could then send them out. We're going to be equipped in these 3 weeks so that we might be sent out with a renewed confidence. Now, the first time that Jesus appeared to some of His disciples, it's called the road to Emmaus. It's just before the passage up on the screen that we have in Luke 24. And they didn't even know who He was, but He opened up the Scriptures to them, and their eyes were opened. and they go running back to Jerusalem, and they go in and they find the disciples hiding out. Remember, it's a dark time for them. And then all of a sudden, Jesus shows up. He doesn't open the door, He doesn't knock, He doesn't ring the doorbell, He just He just comes in, and there He is. And they're amazed, and He shows them His hands and His feet and His spear and His hole in His side. And then He says, "Hey, you got something to eat?" Because maybe they thought He was a ghost, maybe they thought He was an apparition. But, they gave Him a piece of fish, right? It says they gave Him a piece of broiled fish, and He took and ate it before them. A ghost doesn't do that. Maybe there were a few bones left on the plate afterwards, but He's real. And then He said to them, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you." What? That everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled. Then He opened their minds to understand the Scriptures. And that's why I've called this 3-week series, Open Your Mind. One of my favorite movies is the first Matrix. And I don't know if you remember when Morpheus gave Neo the choice, red pill, blue pill. And then he goes to Neo, he says, "Open your mind." Well, we're going to get the pill of the Bible that's going to open our minds to understand the Scriptures. And first of all, wouldn't you have just loved to have been in that little discipleship session? So there's so many things that we could cover. We're going to just hit some of the highlights. And the first week, we're talking about what the Scriptures had to say about Messiah in the law. That is the 5 books of Moses. And there are probably about 300 prophecies in all of the Older Testament that Jesus fulfilled. We're going to not hit all 300 of them. There's a lot you can study, but because we're talking about the 5 books of Moses, I've chosen 5 very specific messianic prophecies from the first 5 books of Moses, also called the Torah, and we're going to look at them one by one. The first one is the earliest of prophecies, and it's found in the book of Genesis, chapter 3 and verse 15. where it says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Now, this context is that God is speaking to the serpent after the fall of Adam and Eve. And so what we're seeing here is the first ray of hope after the fall. God speaks in the darkest of hours of the human experience, when all had been broken, when all had been lost. The Garden of Eden was now forbidden for Adam and for Eve. And in this dark and broken part of that earliest time, God speaks to the serpent. And he says, the one who deceived Adam and Eve, I'm going to put enmity between you, that is the serpent, and the woman, that is Eve, between your offspring and her offspring. And he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Now, theologians call this verse the proto-evangelium, the first announcement of good news, because this had just been a terrible thing that had happened. There was a separation between God and man, and the serpent, who is the representation of evil, of Lucifer, of Satan, had deceived and caused such brokenness. And yet, in this curse, which is really what it is, God pronouncing a curse on Lucifer, on the serpent, not all serpents, but as Satan had manifested himself as a serpent, there is this curse, I'm going to put enmity between you and the woman. And of course, that has been throughout history in evidence. Who here likes snakes? Nobody likes snakes. Very few people like snakes, but particularly the fact that Satan, in the form of a serpent, deceived the woman, and the woman deceived the man, and now we're all deceiving one another. The brokenness of the world that we see all around us was first introduced through this story, through this reality, and this enmity has been part of our world ever since. But the ray of hope is this, that it's about the seed. That word offspring in the Hebrew is zerah, seed. And the interesting thing is that there's a masculine use of the word zerah, but it's the zerah, the seed, in producing life. The man is the one who has the seed that is part of giving birth. But it's the seed of what? Of the woman. So somehow the woman is going to be connected uniquely to the birth of someone who is going to do what? Who's going to bruise or crush the head of the serpent. So how do you kill a snake? You crush its head. But in the process of this offspring, the seed of the woman, crushing the head of the snake, his heel is also going to be bruised, is also going to be bitten by the snake. And so we see in this the very first evidence of a promise of one who's going to come, who's going to put an end to this one who had caused the enmity, who had caused the brokenness, who had brought the fall, this ray of hope in the darkest of hours. And if you look back in some of the translations of this passage, even though the word Messiah is not mentioned in Genesis 3:15, we find that in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, that is called the Septuagint, and then also something called the Targum, which is like a paraphrase from early times, like kind of like the Living Bible of the Old Testament, but in Hebrew or Aramaic. It says, "He, the Messiah, shall crush your head." So there's always been a sense in Jewish literature, going all the way back, that even though the word Messiah is not used in this passage, it's a messianic passage. It's one that looks forward in hope to what is to come. And we see that in its fulfillment, that the New Testament picks up this very theme. For example, in Romans chapter 16 and verse 20, it talks about Satan crushing underfoot. I mean, God, the Messiah, crushing underfoot Satan. You can look that reference up. In Galatians chapter 4 and verse 4, it talks about Jesus being born of the seed of the woman. So Paul, in both Romans and Galatians, makes reference to this passage as being fulfilled in the person of Jesus. And then in Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 14, it talks about Jesus destroying through his own death Satan. And then finally, in the book of Revelation chapter 12 and verse 9 and 17, there's an allusion to the war of Satan against the woman and her offspring. And this is a picture of the followers of Jesus. The woman is the church and her followers. And so we see that all throughout the New Testament, there's a reflection back on this very first, this proto-evangelium. There's going to become someone born of a woman, the seed of a woman. And next week, we're going to talk about the more specific prophecy about the virgin birth, because that's exactly what's being alluded to here, that somehow instead of a man being involved, it's just a woman. The offspring of a woman who's going to crush the head of the one who brought in all the brokenness to this world. You see, hope comes in the darkest of hours, and it springs forth as a light, and it begins to paint the picture of one who is to come, the seed of the woman, the Messiah. Let's go on to the second prophecy that we're going to look at today, which is found in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. And this is the beginning of what's called the Abrahamic covenant, that the Messiah himself would be the descendant of Abraham. We start to begin to narrow the picture down. A picture is being painted here. First of all, this one who's coming, the Messiah, the anointed one, would be the seed of the woman. Second picture we're looking at today is that the Messiah would come from the seed of Abraham. In Genesis 12, verse 3, this prophecy comes as a ray of hope in a dark hour, because Genesis chapter 1 through 11 tells us the story of the development of the human race. And in chapter 11, we get to a very climactic point and a dark hour. It's called the Tower of Babel. You remember that story? All of the peoples of the earth got together and they said, hey, we're going to build a tower all the way up to the skies, and we're going to be like God. Just like in the beginning, what the serpent said to Eve is, you know, God knows that in the day that you eat of the fruit, you're going to be like him. And now in the Genesis chapter 11, we're going to be like God. And God confuses their language, remember? And they all scatter. And that's how we come to this tremendous world brokenness, that people are against one another, nations are against nations, and that's been the story of human history ever since. But in the midst of this dark time, when people are scattered, they can't even communicate, there's a ray of hope. And that is that God raises up a nation through whom he's going to continue to fulfill this promise. Hope after this dispersion. And God says to Abram, get up from the land you're living, go to the land I'll show you, and I'll do three things for you. First of all, I'll make your name great. And if you follow the life of Abraham through the Bible, this is not such a great guy. You know, he was ready to turn his wife over to Pharaoh in order to save his own skin. He did the same thing a second time later on in the story. He doesn't seem like the most integrous person. He came from a family of idol worshipers. In fact, there's a story in the Talmud, which is the Jewish commentary on the scriptures, that say that Abraham's daddy was in the business of making and selling idols for a living. So he had no claim on God's favor, you see. And he was living in Ur of the Chaldees, which is modern-day Iraq. And God spoke to him. And that's always the case when it comes to God. When he brings hope, the initiative comes from him, not from us. And he says to Abram, get up from the land you're living. Go to the land I will show you. Didn't even have a final destination. There were no Google Maps, and even no AAA back then, Just go. And I'll do 3 things for you. And this is what we call the Abrahamic covenant. And one time, you should do a study on what covenants are all about. These contracts, these relationships that God establishes, because when he makes a covenant, he never breaks a covenant. And this Abrahamic covenant is foundational to so much of our understanding of the scriptures. And God says, I'll make your name great, even though he wasn't a great guy. And here we are thousands of years later talking about him, not because of how great he was, but because of how great God is. He said, I'm going to make you a great nation. And this is important because, of course, we know at the time that Abram and his wife were in their 70s and they had no children. Sarah was barren. And God likes to bring life out of dead things. He brings hope in the midst of darkness. And he said, you're going to have a child. In fact, not only just a child, I'm going to make you a great nation. And here's a promise that's been tested. For thousands of years, Abraham gave birth to Isaac, and Isaac, Jacob, and Jacob, the 12 tribes of Israel who are in existence to this very day, despite the Hamans and the Herods and the Hitlers and the Husseins and the Yom HaShoah of history. Because God made a promise. Not because of how great Abraham's descendants are, because we've been a great example of failure. We're just a microcosm of the rest of the world. We're like all those other nations running around after the Tower of Babel. But God said, no, you know what? I'm going to work with you. I can work with you. I'm going to do something. I'm going to make you a great nation. And so they exist to this day because of him. He's so great. But this is now the prophecy. In you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. A blessing so great it can't be contained by one man or by one family or nation, but bubbles up and flows over to all the nations of the world. God reaffirms that promise later on in Genesis chapter 18, where the Lord says, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? Some people say, why did God choose the Jews? Well, God chose Jewish people in order to bless everyone else. It's because of his love for all people that he chose this one man. And from him, this family. And from that family, Abraham's greater son, the Messiah. The hope of all the nations in the darkest of hours, coming from this family that had no children. That's the way God loves to do things. He brings hope in the midst of darkness. And so we find in the New Testament Peter preaching right after the ascension in Jerusalem. And he speaks to his crowd, this crowd of Jewish people, on the Feast of Pentecost, or as we call it in Hebrew, Shavuot. And he said, all the prophets who have spoken from Samuel and those who came after him also proclaimed these days. You are the sons of the prophets and of the covenant, that is the Jewish people, that God made with your fathers, saying to Abraham, And in your offspring, there's that word zerah, the seed, shall all the families of the earth be blessed. God, having raised up his servant, that is Jesus, sent him to you first to bless you by turning every one of you from your wickedness. So in a nutshell, God raised up the Jewish people in order to be the vehicle through which this messianic hope, first referenced in Genesis chapter 3, would now be a blessing to all the nations. Jesus is the fulfillment, Peter is saying, of this promise that goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 12. Are you with me? All right, we're going to go on now to the third prophecy that I've selected for this evening, which also is in the book of Genesis, Genesis chapter 49 and verse 10. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. So what is this all about? This is actually a prophecy that was made by Jacob, the patriarch, on his deathbed. And I think we actually studied this not too long ago, the different predictions that Jacob was making concerning his 12 sons. And so this promise is hope after the patriarchs. Remember, this was not an easy time for the children of Israel. They had, out of famine and almost destitute condition, made their way to Egypt. And now their father, the light of the whole community of the sons of Jacob, were watching the patriarch die, the last of the fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he's dying. And they're in Egypt. And they're about to go into slavery. And in the midst of this dark time, hope comes again. The ray of light shines in the darkness. There is going to be a ruler. There is going to be someone whose coming is going to change all of this slavery that you're about to go through. The scepter shall not depart from Judah. Judah ends up being the next little piece in the puzzle of what this Messiah is going to be like. We start out the seed of the woman. Pay attention to the woman. Look to see what's coming from the woman, because that's where the Messiah is going to emanate from. Pay attention to Abraham, because from his lineage is coming this ray of hope that's going to bless all the nations of the world. And now, we're narrowing it down even more. It's one particular tribe, you see. It's Judah. Judah is the one who is going to be having the scepter, that is the ruler's staff, and this is where the Hebrew text gets a little bit challenging. The promise of the scepter indicates that Judah is going to be the tribe through which Messiah will come. Remember, Jesus is called what? The Lion of the tribe of Judah. And Micah also tells us, we're going to look at this next week, that it is from Judah and from the house of David and from Bethlehem, the house of bread, that the Messiah, Jesus, would be born. But the enigma from this passage is in this phrase, until tribute comes to him, or in the Hebrew, when you don't know what to translate, sometimes in the Bible, they'll just leave the word as it is. And until Shiloh or Shiloh comes. So the translators have tried to, well, what is Shiloh? It's a place, but what does the word mean? And some have said, until tribute comes to him. And it's really a reference to who's the him? Until tribute comes to, do you remember whatever there was a time when tribute came to Jesus? How about when he was a babe in the manger? How about when the wise men came and they brought gold and frankincense and myrrh, a fulfillment of the promise that this Messiah would have tribute brought to him, and ultimately he would indeed be the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And unto him, the last phrase, shall be the obedience of what? The Jewish people? No, there's that phrase, the peoples, the nations, all nations, once again. So this is not a peculiar prophecy that's just for the Jewish people. That's the wonderful thing about the scriptures, is that even though it all comes out of a context of the nation of Israel and the Jewish people constantly, and here we've now seen reference after reference in the very first book that it's all about everyone. That God raised up the Jewish people so that folks here at Cornerstone could get to know the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. See, that's the ray of hope, the light in the darkness, that God intends to bless all peoples. And so he said, keep your eye on the seed of the woman. Keep your eye on the children of Abraham. Keep your eye on the tribe of Judah. And the picture is coming together, and the hope and the light is shining through the scriptures. Jesus, I'm sure, was pointing to all of these things, and ultimately, to him every knee will bow. Unto him will be what? The obedience of the peoples. That's the backdrop of every knee shall bow, every tongue shall confess. God said it back in Genesis chapter 49. You see it? It's all there. A hope for all of us. All right, let's move on to the fourth prophecy. The Messiah would be the star coming out of Jacob. Numbers chapter 24. And the context for this passage is that Israel has been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. And they're just about ready to enter into the promised land when there is a Moabite king who says, I'm going to wipe them out. They're never going to make it into that promised land. I'm going to wipe them out. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to get this really well-known prophet named Balaam, and I'm going to get him to curse these wretched people of Israel, and they're going to be destroyed right out here in the plains of Moab. And he stands up, this prophet for hire, Balaam, and he's supposed to curse the people, and he's been paid a princely sum to do it. And instead, he says this, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. It shall crush the forehead of Moab and break down all the sons of Seth. There is, for every Moabite king or every other leader of any other nation that tries to destroy the Jewish people, you are going to be crushed. No matter what, because God staked his reputation on the perpetuity of these people. You try to destroy them and you're going to be destroyed. And throughout history, we've seen that. God keeps his promise. There was one of the last Jewish leaders to fight against Rome before the Jewish people were actually dispersed by the Roman army. We can go to Masada and see the remnants of that last battle. But the one who was leading the Jewish people at the very end was a guy by the name of Bar Kokhba. And the Jewish people were following him and were fighting against him until Rabbi Akiba, who was the most prominent rabbi at the time, changed his name to Bar Kosiba, which means son of the star. And when that happened, all the Jewish believers in Jesus said, well, we can't fight with this guy because we know who the son of the star is. And his name is Jesus. He is the star who came out of Jacob. He is the one whom the Magi said, what? We've seen his star in the east, and now we want to know, where's the one who the star that rises out of Jacob has come, and it shines right over Bethlehem. The Magi were looking for the star that Balaam saw, but not near. And the scepter that Judah was talking about bringing, that would crush the forehead of Moab and break down the sons of Seth. This is Jesus himself, the Messiah, the star, the one whom the Magi were looking for. He is the fulfillment of this great prophecy. And in Revelation 22, verse 16, what does Jesus call himself? The bright and morning star. He is the fulfillment of this. In a dark time, when the nation was trying to be destroyed, just prior to their getting into the promised land, which God had made so clear that he would fulfill, this hope comes, this light, this ray of light dawns, and we see the star, the Messiah, the hope of all the nations. Number 5, from Deuteronomy chapter 18. The Messiah would be a prophet like Moses. Moses was the greatest leader of the Jewish people. He was the Redeemer, the one who delivered them from bondage and slavery in Egypt so long ago. And he was the one who spoke to God face to face, so much so that he glowed, and the people of Israel didn't want to look him in the face, so they asked him to put a veil over his face so that they couldn't see the glory, the kavod, the brightness of God shining from this man named Moses, drawn out, Moshe Rabbeinu, as he's called by religious Jews today, Moses, our teacher. But Moses had led his people for 40 years in the wilderness. Moses had so much life experience. Now, at about 120 years of age, having been told by God that because he struck the rock twice when God said, speak to the rock, he wouldn't be able to go into the promised land. And just before going up on the mountain to look over and to see, Moses now gives them Deuteronomy, the second law, the re-articulation of the covenant that God had made, the word of promise. But Moses wasn't going to be able to go with them into the promised land. What do you do when your leader, the only one that you've known who brought together a nation and led them out of slavery through the wilderness to the very edge of the promised land, is about to die? Well, you need a word of hope. A word of hope that's coming about Moses. The people are afraid. Who's going to talk to God for us? When you're gone, what's going to happen? How is this going to work out? And the Lord said to me, Moses says in Deuteronomy 18, verse 17, they are right in what they have spoken. They're afraid. But here's the promise. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. Verse 19, and whoever will not listen to my words that he shall speak in my name, I myself will require it of him. So here's a prophet that if you don't listen to this one, you are in big trouble. A prophet like Moses. Well, the scriptures tell us that there was never a prophet like Moses, except there was. And that's the fulfillment of all the hope and promise of the one who is to come, the Messiah. What was Moses like? Well, other prophets heard the word of the Lord in a vision, but Moses face to face. And Deuteronomy 34 verse 10 says, there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, who knew the Lord face to face. And in John 6:14, when the people saw what he had done, they said, this is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world. So they were looking for the prophet, and they knew that that prophet was the fulfillment of Genesis 3:15 and Genesis 49 and Genesis 12 and all the other prophecies. Someone who was just like Moses, who didn't have to wait to hear or to see a vision in order to speak concerning God, but who was himself a prophet who saw God face to face. The law was given through Moses, but grace and truth, John tells us, comes through Yeshua HaMashiach, through Jesus the Messiah. And they considered him to be a prophet like Moses. In Acts 3:22, Peter says, Moses said, the Lord God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brothers. You shall listen to him and whatever he tells you. This is Moses, Peter says, who said to the Israelites, God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brothers. They're pointing to Jesus. As the people saw him in John, so Peter, in preaching the gospel, said, this is exactly the fulfillment of Deuteronomy chapter 18. Jesus is the Messiah. He is the promised one. He is the prophet like Moses. He is the ray of darkness after a leaderless nation wondered who was going to take us to the promised land. And Jesus was a prophet. Remember what he said about himself. The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and on the third day raised. That's a prophecy. Jesus said to Peter, before the rooster crows this day, you will deny me 3 times. What happened to poor Peter? He did exactly what Jesus predicted he would. In Luke 21, verses 5 through 6, while some were speaking of the temple and how it was adorned with noble stones and offerings, Jesus said, as for these things, the days will come when there will not be one stone left upon another. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those who were sent to you. Behold, your house is left you desolate. Jesus predicted the destruction of Jerusalem and of the temple, and it was fulfilled within a generation of his uttering that word. Jesus was a prophet. And like Moses, he spoke to God face to face. In fact, no one has seen God at any time, the scriptures say, but the only begotten, who is full of grace and truth, he has revealed him. If you want to see what God is like, you want to see God face to face, look at Jesus. He is that ray of hope. He is the promise in a dark time. Praise his name. Amen? Amen. God bless you.